Hi, it's John Young here. We're going to be looking at one of the tools in the Saltland Genie app today, particularly the Sustainable Grazing on Saltland Economics Calculator. This calculator is designed to answer the question, what are the economics of revegetating saltland with a salt-tolerant pasture? And the tool is set up as a partial budget, and in that it only looks at the things that are going to change on your farm as a result of planting saltland pastures, and it values the feed from the saltland pasture on the basis of equivalent feed cost. And there's a couple of options that we'll have a look at as to how you can value the saltland pasture. So what we're going to do is I'll run through how to use the tool, and we're going to do that using some data from an actual case study farm that was monitored as part of the SGSL, that's a Sustainable Grazing on Saltland Land project, and this was some saltland pasture that was established back in 2005. So we're going to use some actual numbers for the establishment cost and the grazing that was monitored on that site as an example of how to use this tool. So what you can see on the screen at the moment is a blank version of the tool, as it will be if you access it through the Saltland Genie app. And we'll just scroll down so you get an overview of the full input screen and the output. So there's 5 sections that we'll look at, and to get started, we will run through them in order. So we'll start up here at the site description, and this is purely for your records, so that you have a description of what this particular analysis was about. So we will type in our description, which I'm going to call Saltland example, and you're more likely to type in the name of the paddock where you're considering revegetating, and the area. So the area is all the calculations are based on per hectare calculations, and the site area is purely there to give you the financial impact on the whole farm basis or the whole site basis. So for this case study, it was a 20 hectare site that was revegetated. The type of grazing animal, and there's a drop down box here. It gives you the options of sheep or cattle, and for the case study farm that was grazed with sheep, the selection of sheep or cattle is really only there as a record for when you're entering your grazing days, so that you know whether they're grazing days of sheep or cattle, which are obviously quite different. And it also alters the estimated dry matter consumption per grazing day. So that's the first section. We'll then move down to section number 2, the analysis duration. So these are some of the financial inputs and our assumptions that are behind how long and how the calculations are being done and the results that are presented. So the starting year, and this analysis or the case study started in 2005. So we'll change that to 2005, and the actual year doesn't matter. It's the time from the start that's important, and therefore putting the number in that's relevant for when you're expecting to establish your pasture. The analysis period, the tool is set up to analyse the financial impact of establishing the saltland pasture for anything up to 20 years. So the number can be less than 20, but it's not able to be more than 20. And mostly leaving it at 20 is what you would do. And that's because the more important value of the two is the lifespan of the saltland pasture that you're going to establish. So how often do you need to incur the costs of re-establishing? And for our case study farm, we're going to work with a 15-year lifespan. So that's saying that every 15 years, the productivity of the plants that you've established will have diminished, and it's worthwhile re-establishing. So you need to consider that for your site. The more extreme the site, the more often it may need to be re-established. And a site that is less saline may need to be re-established less often. And the final input in this section is the discount rate. This is the equivalent of an interest rate. So what interest rate are you earning in the bank is one way to think about it. And perhaps a better way to think about it is the return that you would achieve if you invested your money in an alternative investment on your farm. So what's the other next best option for improving productivity on your farm, and what sort of return on investment would you get from that investment? So we'll work on 4%. That's a fairly typical discount rate for investment analyses at the moment. The next section, so section number 3, is the establishment costs. And we enter these as a cost per hectare, and it's both the capital costs of establishing the plants and the infrastructure, fencing and water if that's required, and also a maintenance cost per year. So on the case study farm, they spent $526 in the first year per hectare, and so that the tool also calculates for you what that cost is for the total site. So in this case, that was $10,500 spent in the first year for plant establishment, and then in 2007 there was further expenditure associated with fencing the site and adding water, and that was a further $250 per hectare. Now within the SGSL project, there was various case studies and monitoring carried out that looked at the range of costs, and so that information you can review that. Obviously, the more detail you put into establishment, the extra expense of how you establish the plants and what species you grow could impact the productivity and the lifespan. So there's usually a trade-off between lower establishment costs with lower productivity, with higher establishment costs with higher productivity. And within this tool, you can check some of that trade-off between costs and return, although the tool itself is not really set up to make that an easy comparison, but you can do it if you enter different costs and different productivity. There's also capacity to enter the maintenance cost per year. So this is things like if you're fertilising, costs of maintaining the water, particularly the water is obviously very important for when grazing saltland pasture. And for the case study site, that was around $41 per hectare per year. So for the total site, that was $800 per site. And the maintenance commenced in 2007, so at the beginning of grazing. So at this point, we've entered all the costs associated with getting the site up and running, and we can have a look at the cost and returns at this point. There is no returns incorporated, so what we're looking at is the total cost, and we've got a graph here that the blue bars are the costs that have been incurred. So a larger bar in the first year, which is the establishment of the plants, a smaller bar in the just 2007, associated with fencing and water, and then a small blue bar that's only just visible, which is the annual maintenance cost, and then 15 years later, establishing the plants again. And this yellow line, which is what we call the cumulative cash flow, which is what your bank balance would look like. In this case, dropping down associated with the establishment costs, dropping down some more associated with the fencing and water, dropping and continuing to edge down associated with the annual maintenance costs plus interest that's being incurred. And then at year 15, it drops down quickly and continues. So that's our cumulative cash flow, the difference, which is the difference in your bank balance as a result of incorporating the saltland pasture. As I said, this doesn't include the income, the extra income that you're going to hopefully earn as a result of having the saltland pasture, and we'll go and have a look at that now into the grazing that was achieved on this site and check the effect of that on the returns. So the grazing is entered per year and then at full production. So the way the calculations are carried out that is to allow for sort of less grazing early on, grazing building up, and then achieving a maximum production which retains at that level for the duration of the lifespan of the saltland pasture that you entered back in step number 2. So for the case study farm in 2007, which was the first year that they grazed the pasture that was established, they put on 41.25 sheep per hectare, and they grazed the site for 2 days. So the calculations are done in this part of the sheet, which are there so that you can check whether the numbers that you've typed in are correct. So this is saying that there was 825 sheep grazed the area, which is the number of sheep per hectare times by the area, and that's 83 grazing days per hectare were achieved in that first year of grazing 2 years after the plants were established. So fairly modest grazing at that point. So relatively high stocking rate for a short period. In 2008, there was more grazing, but it was done at a lower stocking rate at 9.9 stock per hectare, but the grazing period was significantly longer, a couple of 2 months of grazing, so 67 days. So that was with 198 sheep in total, and that was a total of 660 grazing days per hectare. And again, the SGSL project monitored amount of grazing on different saltland pastures in different parts of the state. So there's some rules of thumb about amount of grazing that you might expect if you don't have any experience yet, because this is your first saltland pasture. Then you can look at that data and see in my region how much grazing am I likely to achieve. This site that we're working on is a reasonably productive site in the sort of medium to high rainfall zone. So the amount of grazing being achieved on this site is quite high. In 2009, at this site, the stocking rate was increased to 11 DFE per hectare, and that was continued for a little over 3 months, so 108 days. So that was 220 animals and 1,188 grazing days per hectare. So that's a high level of grazing, and they continued at about that level in in 2010 and expected to stay there in the future. In 2010 they had just short of 46 sheep to the hectare for about a month, 28 days. So that was grazed the area with 900 sheep and achieved just a little over 1,200 grazing days per hectare. Part of what the tool calculates is the proportion of full production. So in the first year, only 6% of full production in the amount of grazing they got jumped to 50% in the second year of grazing, and then to just over 90% in the third year of grazing, and then, as I said before, maintaining it at 100% of full production through to the lifespan, which in this case was 15 years, the expected lifespan. So now we've entered the expected productivity, and if you're doing this analysis like we are, so to calculate the result after you've done it, you've entered the actual grazing. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's a couple of different options in the tool about how that grazing is going to be valued, and the grazing is valued as the alternative that the Saltland pasture will substitute for. So it's a valuation through substitution, and therefore the item that you are substituting for, or for the calculations to be correct, the item that you're substituting for needs to be something that you're doing currently. So we have two options. The first option is valuing the Saltland pasture as a substitute for agistment, and in this case we would enter a value of agistment in grazing days, a cost of grazing days per head per week. So we enter a value in option one for the value of agistment, which might typically be 35 cents per head per week. So for option one, we're entering the value of the salt bush as a substitute for agistment, and if agistment is around sort of 40 cents per head per week, that is near 6 cents per head per day, which is the value that we enter into the spreadsheet. So 6 cents, and then we can have a look at the impact of that on the returns, and what we see looking at our graph is that we now have these dark blue bars, which are the return per site, and at 40 cents per head per week, or 6 cents per head per day, the return from using the salt bush as a substitute for agistment is insufficient to cover the costs of establishment. So we see that our yellow line, which was the cumulative cash flow, is not as negative as it was before, but it's not positive either. So there's the Saltland pasture is not giving you a return on investment. So if we could look at some alternative prices, if agistment was up closer to $1 per head per week, which is 14 cents per head per day, then we see at that price the cumulative cash flow does get positive. And what we see, the extra values that are provided is that the years to pay off. So by what year do you get your money back? It's happening in 11 years. If adjustment was at $1 per sheep, this is per sheep per week, and our cumulative cash flow will get to around $17,000 prior to the saltland pasture needing to be re-established. And then it would follow the same pattern again from dropping down and then starting to increase as you get the value from the grazing. The benefit cost ratio is another output from the tool. So benefit cost ratio is the ratio of the income you earn relative to the expense that you've incurred after you've allowed for interest. So in this case, it's saying your income is 1.31 times your expense. So you can sort of think of that as you're making 30% more than your money back. So it's not a number that you're likely to use as a farmer, but it is the way that investment analyses are usually looked at in the scientific community. But I think as a farmer, you're more likely to find the cumulative cash flow a useful concept, because that gives you the picture of what's going to happen to your bank account. In this case, drop down, then increase back to where you were at year 11, and everything past year 11 is profit. So that's the first option. The second option is valuing the saltland pasture as a replacement for grain feeding. I think this is the more realistic option. That is actually how the saltland pasture will be used, because most people aren't adjusting stock off the farm every year, but most farmers are feeding grain every year. So I think this is a more realistic way to value the saltland pasture, and it also tends to give a slightly higher value than adjustment. So in order to do the calculations as a substitute for grain feeding, we need to know the amount of grain that would have been used in order to achieve the same animal performance as was achieved on the salt bush. And so we've mostly looked at the number of grazing days as grazing days while the animals were maintaining weight. So we put in a maintenance requirement, and it depends on the sort of live weight of your stock and what sort of stock you were grazing the saltland pasture with. So if they're pregnant ewes, then their energy requirements are higher than if they're dry ewes. The typical value is around 7.5 megajoules per head per day. So that number we'll stick with the standard number. The energy content of the ration, so 13.3 is a typical number for if you're feeding lupin grain. If you're going to be valuing this using oats or barley, you would likely use a lower number, so maybe somewhere around 10 or 11 for oats, and around 11.5 to 12.5 if you're using barley. And then you put in the relevant cost for the type of grain that you're looking at. So for this example, we're going to use $350 per tonne for our lupins landed on farm. And there's also an option here to enter the average rate of grain feeding while on the saltland pasture. So that's associated with, we'll just scroll up a little so we can see our grazing assumptions. So this cell is asking, while achieving this grazing that's been entered up on the top, so let's look at the full production value where we're grazing with 46 sheep per hectare for 28 days, how much grain feeding was fed while doing that? And this number wasn't actually recorded in the SGSL case study, but I'm going to put in that there was 50 grams per head per day fed on average over those 28 days in order to run the 46 ewes per hectare. So now we've entered all the information that's required to do our calculation. So I'll scroll back down so that we can see the result. And one thing you notice is that by valuing the salt bush as a substitute for grain feeding, that's more valuable than as a substitute for agistment, even if agistment is as costly as $1 per head per week. So we're seeing here that our years to pay off now is 8 years. So we're getting a return, or the Saltland pasture has paid for the establishment costs by year 8, and all grazing beyond year 8 is profit. The benefit cost ratio is 1.68, so almost 1.7. So for every dollar you spend establishing the salt bush, you're getting $1.70 or $1.68 of income. And that means that by the time that the salt bush has to be, or the Saltland pasture has to be re-established at year 15, the bank account has increased to nearly $25,000 in the black, having got to nearly $17,000 in the red after all the establishment costs have been incurred. So that's the use of the spreadsheet, the use of the tool. They're the steps that you need to carry out. Now that you've filled out all the cells, we can do some what-if analysis to say, well, what are the results sensitive to? And one of them that is very important is the cost of the grain. So if Saltland pasture is substituting for grain feeding, then the amount of, or the cost of that grain is quite important. So if we change that up to a price that's a bit more relevant to, or more realistic for the summer of 2021, maybe $450 a tonne, and maybe even that's a little low. We see now that our years to break even are 7, and our cumulative cash flow is getting close. Instead of being around $25,000, is now closer to $50,000. So the value of growing Saltland pasture as an alternative to feeding grain is very sensitive to the price of grain. Likewise, if we were to reduce the value of the grain down to $250, the net value of investing in Saltland pasture, the cumulative cash flow reduces down to around $7,000. And the years to pay off is now 12 years. So we see that the value of having an alternative feed source on the farm is very dependent on the value of grain. An assumption that's behind the calculations that's important to understand is that this calculation is representing using the Saltland pasture as a substitute for full ration grain feed. So that would be the equivalent of having animals in a confinement. And if you haven't got animals in confinement and feeding them a full ration, then this calculation is overestimating slightly your benefit that you would achieve. So maybe for those of you who do have animals in confinement, offering them a full ration, then this is giving you a very good estimate of the value of your salt bush. So it does mean that it's likely that the first area of Saltland pasture that you establish will be well represented by these calculations, because there will be times during the year where you are offering animals a higher proportion of their diet as supplement, and therefore you could use the Saltland pasture to substitute for that supplement. As you've grown more Saltland pasture, then it's likely that extra Saltland pasture won't substitute for full ration green feeding, and therefore the value that you achieve will not be as high as being estimated by this tool, and therefore you'll need to do a more complicated analysis to accurately calculate the value of extra feed. Profitability of establishing Saltland pasture is also likely to be sensitive to establishment cost. Now, we do expect establishment cost and productivity to be associated. There's high establishment costs as are associated with establishment method and also species selection or species choice. But in this example, we're just going to look at adjusting the establishment cost without changing the productivity. So if we thought that we could save $150 per hectare, so instead of establishment costing a little over $500 per hectare, it was done at $350 per hectare, we can type that reduced cost in and have a look at the results. So that has reduced the years to pay off from 8 down to 7 and has increased the benefit cost ratio up to almost 2. And that means that at the end of the sort of 14-year, 15-year period, that the cumulative cash flow is increased to over $30,000. So closer to $35,000 instead of $25,000. So we certainly do are able to calculate the effects of changing the costs, the productivity, the price of grain. So go ahead and put in some of your own values and test some scenarios for profitability on your property. But also remember that this tool is only trying to quantify the financial implications of establishing Saltland pasture, and you may very well have other goals, such as the aesthetics or managing your annual feed supply and how it varies with different seasons. So you need to project those values on top of the results from this calculator. So go ahead and put in your own values now.